Clear to engage. Time on target. 5 mics. Out.
We just cold open here. We don't do openings. We figured out after like 25 episodes that doesn't work. Welcome to the podcast, Aaron
Well, thank you guys
Sarnoff-Wood.
both for having me.
At the legislature, actually, we got the report
Yes, we did.
from the wonderful, amazing, just truly transformational work group task force. It's a task force. So here's the lingo for everybody. A work group is an unofficial gathering together of people. It can be convened by anybody. It can contain anybody. A task force is created specifically by the legislature, typically has a specified list of people or categories of people that serve on the task force. Typically, it includes legislators, although for whatever reason, probably political reasons, the legislators are non-voting members oftentimes in the task force.
Yep,
But the
that's
key with the
correct.
task force is the makeup of that task force. And usually, if you write the bill or you're in the majority, you get to decide what the makeup is of the task force, and you kind of try to tilt it to be more your direction. And we'll talk a little bit about that there. But Aaron, you were a member of this task force, were you not?
I was indeed. Yes, for the last year, we've been meeting biweekly as a task force to go over addiction, taxation, and kind of the fallout from both. If I may, I can go into like kind of a little history of what got me here.
Yeah,
Um,
I'd love to know how you joined
Yeah.
the task force, but you can start before that. How did you get into the
Yeah,
industry?
so I'm one of the founders of Towns Ciderhouse, and we're a craft hard apple cider producer. We're based out of Corvallis, Oregon. My buddy and I started in a garage 15 years ago, and we've grown our business. We're now, I'm actually proud to say, by IRI, and that's a sales tracking platform, the largest craft beverage company in the state of Oregon in grocery sales. So we passed every brewery in the state. We're now number one. So it's pretty crazy for us to see that because again, we started just a couple of kids in a garage with a dream, and things have grown. So as far as this task force is concerned, my story started a couple years back. Representative Sanchez sponsored a bill, and that was House Bill 3296, and she sponsored that at the request of Oregon Recovers. And for those that aren't familiar, Oregon Recovers is a special interest group, a neo-prohibitionist group. Their founder, Mike Marshall, has said his intention is to tax alcohol out of existence. And again, if you're to read that bill, House Bill 3296, that seems to be the exact intent of the bill. It proposed a 2,600% increase to excise taxes. And excise taxes are the taxes that I pay as a producer of alcoholic beverages for the privilege of producing that product. Now, I still pay all the other, standard business taxes that a business would pay in Oregon. The excise tax is exclusive to alcohol production. Now, a 2,600% increase would have made Oregon the most heavily taxed state in the nation by a large margin. And if that wasn't enough, the bill also included an annual increase after that initial bump, commensurate with the consumer price index, which would not only make us the highest tax state, but would guarantee that we would remain the highest tax state and that the delta between us and the rest of the country would increase every single year after that. Luckily for us, that bill did not ever make it off the floor. Because again, had that passed, I ran some numbers, and the increase in my Oregon taxes would have been larger than my company's national profitability. So obviously, again, that bill entirely impossible for a producer such as myself to actually, survive, which I believe was the intent of the bill to begin with.
How far did that bill go, Aaron? Like, did it get committee hearings? Did it get through committee?
It did not, I don't believe.
Okay.
I
And
just looked it up. No, not even a hearing. That's
Yeah, no, it
that's
was
how
it was
scared a lot of the other legislators were of it.
well, I mean, again, it was pretty extreme. And so the next legislative session, Sanchez came back again at the request of Oregon Recovers, this time with House Bill 3312. And that one was only a 1,200% increase, very modest compared to the 2,600, the prior attempt. And it suffered the same fate as the original bill did. It never got past committee, and I don't think it even made it to the floor.
Yeah, no committee hearings for that one.
And again, to Sanchez's explanation, she claims that those bills were never intended to pass, but they were actually intended to scare alcohol to the conversation. Now, it was a strange stance from my perspective, given I don't recall alcohol ever been invited to the conversation before these tax bills, and it seems, like declaring war is an interesting way to try to get somebody to the negotiation table. But here we are. So after the failure of those two bills, Representative Sanchez put forward House Bill 3610, which formed the task force. And ultimately, the task force goal, at least what I believe Sanchez's goal with the task force was to determine what the tax increase should be, not whether or if there should be a tax increase. And before the task force was originally convened, I actually reached out to her office and wrote an email, and I asked, hey, why are you supporting such extreme tax measures? These look like they're designed to, destroy my business. Can you please explain yourself? And she sent me an email with a number of justifications, and I researched each of them, and to my surprise, found that each of the talking points she provided was either false or misleading. And so for the next year, I started studying a lot of the dialogue that I was seeing around alcohol and taxation, and found that a lot of the conversation was based on misleading information. And so when I heard that this the task force 3610 was being convened, I volunteered to participate because I thought this would be a good opportunity to understand where this information was coming from and hopefully do something to correct the record.
No, I think you were recruited by Big Alcohol to be their voice of the task force, right? I mean, that's how I
Well,
think
the fun,
that's what they're gonna say. That's what they say about people if
well,
they
if
don't
it's big
have
alcohol,
their opinion.
I should look around because, like I said, we started in a garage. It's just a group of friends. But
Yeah.
so the task force originally was, I believe, 4 alcohol industry members and 16 other members. We pushed
Mhm.
hard in order to have 2 additional members added because the original makeup of the task force did not actually include anybody who produced alcohol. So the 2 members that were added were myself representing the cider industry and Jamie Floyd of Ninkasi Brewing. So
Hmm.
that there was at least a voice on this task force from somebody who actually produced alcohol for a living.
But a
Yeah,
lot of agency voices, a lot of healthcare voices, a lot of basically the other half of the task force is stacked with state agencies or nonprofits that are likely to benefit from the tax increase because those taxes are going to are theoretically dedicated funding revenue that they can use to do whatever it is they want to accomplish, right? Ostensibly it is to
Absolutely.
reduce problem alcohol use, right?
Yep.
But that
And
dedicated funding stream obviously means a lot for their budgets. It obviously means a lot for their programs, and it's hard to get general fund dollars. So there's a lot of incentive for them just in their positions to push for this tax and to push for it any way that they can.
yeah. And again, as you already mentioned, the makeup of the task force had 6 industry members, 9 pro-recovery advocates, and the director of the OLCC is the last member there, voting member. So we were already looking at a 6-to-9 ratio as far as viewpoints coming into this thing. And as we
Yeah.
looked at actual task force meetings, the alcohol industry was only allocated 2 of 20 meetings to make our story heard. The rest of the meetings, either all or in part, were anti-alcohol conversations.
What so my understanding of task forces and work groups like Reagan talked about, I think, which I find work groups are basically what they give the minority party when they pretty much want to be nice and not let the but they want it to go away anyway. So they give them a work group, right? They're like, oh, we'll give you a work group, and we don't really care what you come up with. Task forces have a little bit more teeth in them. They're usually either to keep a conversation going, like this one, I think, or to set up a conversation, right? And this was maybe a little bit of both, right? Probably keep something going as well as to set up the tax increase. How, because in Oregon, the way that I know it, this tax I find interesting because the whole goal is to help people who are addicted to alcohol. So let's tax alcohol more to pay people to get off of alcohol. But yet, if they're actually successful, they won't have taxes to help keep people off alcohol. So it's the oddity of the taxing something that you're trying to basically get rid of is just very oddly weird to me to begin with. And we do this with all four of the sin taxes, right? So recreational drugs, smoking, drinking, and gambling. And the whole goal is to tax the thing that we want people to not do, but yet we need the taxes for people to do.
Funny you mention that. Then some of that came up. For example,
Did it? Okay.
Yeah, that OHA had presented that alcohol consumption was on the rise, that it had increased sharply during the pandemic, and that this tax was necessary to curb what they called excessive consumption. Okay, it's a fair concept anyhow.
Sure.
We started looking into it, and what they had presented though was not based on OLCC tax records. They had their own model to estimate what consumption could be. And the best explanation we could get from them was that it was based on national trends among other data. Well, I pulled the actual tax records from the OLCC, and that shows us how many gallons were produced or imported into Oregon. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean those gallons were consumed, but you have to assume that there's a pretty, tight correlation between what's being produced and imported and what's being consumed. And what we found was that consumption actually dropped rapidly in 2023, right after the pandemic. And at the end of 2023, the level of consumption was the lowest it had been since 2012. Okay. So again, interesting seeing how, again, the OHA was presenting this narrative that we were suffering, rapid increases in consumption when we're actually, as an industry, and again, ask any brewer, 2023 and 2024 have been very hard years as we come out of the pandemic. Bars and restaurants are still suffering. We're not seeing things back the way they were pre-pandemic. And we've seen, dozens of closures of breweries, wineries, cideries, what have you, in the last couple of years. So, like I said, what was interesting though is when we saw that there was increases in consumption from 2010 to 2022. But when we looked at the tax records, that increase in consumption was not coming from beer or wine. 100% of that increase in consumption came from state-controlled spirits. Now, again, the taxes that we're discussing impact only beer and wine. And we also found another interesting fact that the OLCC had been greenlit for a $150 million expansion to their liquor distribution services to accommodate all the liquor growth that they had seen, the liquor sales. And their projections for this expansion project would be an increase in liquor consumption in Oregon by roughly 70%. So basically, at the same time we were being told we have to tax beer and wine to curb consumption, we're spending tax dollars to grow consumption, but of a state-controlled commodity versus one that's suppressing private businesses effectively. And so that was a little bit of a hypocrisy that didn't resonate well with me, that, again, how can we be talking about curbing consumption with taxes when in reality they're talking about expanding consumption in the commodities that they happen to own.
So you're a cider company. Do you fall under the beer?
We are an interesting, really
wine?
ugly, red-headed stepchild of the alcohol world. Half of beer regulations affect us and half of wine regulations do. From a tax perspective, we are technically a wine, although there is federally a cider tax class as well as a wine tax class. And how you're taxed changes by ABV and what ingredients you might include in your cider. So it's very, very complicated, unfortunately, for taxes for us. I think I have to deal with over 90 tax classes across the different states that I distribute
Wow.
to. So it can be quite a challenge, and it changes, like I said, state by state. This product
Yeah.
might be a wine in California, it might be a cider in Oregon, it might be something else somewhere else.
I still have a federal license for a distillery in Prineville, and we had an Oregon license up until September when my business partner and I kind of let it go, and partly because of that. I mean, the amount of paperwork to
Yeah.
sell a
Reporting
fifth
and
of
compliance
liquor,
is intense.
it was just insane. And then the idea of just trying the effort to actually go out and try to sell your product to the marketplace is so intensely difficult that it's surprising that any can even exist, really in the state of Oregon to be able to do it with just the low number of volume of stores. They're able to, the distribution on your guys' standpoint has got to be insane. The ability to only own two licenses. Is that the same with beer and wine? It's the same, right? You can only,
Yeah.
you don't get to have three. You don't get to be a retailer, wholesaler, and a grower or producer, right? You can only have two. So therefore, you have to use somebody else in the supply chain, which just eats it in your margin. If you could do all three, you could probably, make a little bit more money, but they don't allow you to do that in the state of Oregon, which is
And
very
that's
difficult.
one of the things that also never got considered in all this tax conversation in the past is they said, okay, this tax is only, let's say, 25 cents a drink. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's a tax on me, the producer. And then I have to sell my product by law to a distributor who marks that tax up in their price to the retailer, who marks that tax up to the consumer. And so by the time we saw, one of the proposals, and they kept saying, oh, it's only 25 cents a drink. Well, that's still $1.50 a six pack. And by the time that's my cost, by the time it reaches the consumer, that's a $3 to $4 increase on the shelf per six pack.
It's
At
very
least,
much
yeah.
like the gross receipts tax, which
Yep.
stacks every time you guys, because I don't think most people understand this. You sell to the distributor and then the distributor sells to the customer, or is there one more layer
To the
there?
retailer, and then the retailer
To the
sells.
retailer and then to the
Yeah.
customer. So you've got those four different layers. Each one of those exchanges is a sale. It's a transaction, and that transaction is taxed for gross receipts purposes on each business as you
Yep.
do the sale.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is,
So
again, something
that
that they were having
tax
a hard
cascades
time
and stacks. Yeah,
at
exactly. And I think
understanding.
it gives you four times the revenue on a single item. So it's really helpful if you're trying to raise revenue. If you get to tax something three or four times, maybe more. I'm sure there's other items under the gross receipts tax. This is kind of a little bit separate from yours, but it's still kind of the same conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of different products in different categories that have even more steps that get taxed more times. And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't realize. That's a lot of these hidden costs are hidden in these types of taxes.
That cat tax, when it first passed, it was only roughly
Mm-hmm.
0.5% tax, but it represented about a 4.5% to 5% increase on shelf price because every commodity we touch, like our
Mm-hmm.
apples, the farmer paid it, the juice
Right.
processor paid it. We paid the logistics company that shipped them to us paid it. We paid it. The distributor paid it. And that stacks to be really a considerable increase. And again, our lawmakers like to say that we don't have a sales tax in Oregon, but that effectively is a sales tax, and it's even more impactful than a sales tax because, like you said, every time the commodity changes hands, there's another transaction or another charge.
Yep.
As we were talking about taxes, one of the arguments that we like to, that we heard numerously was that Oregon is the lowest taxed alcohol taxes in the nation. But again, they came to that conclusion by comparing Oregon's excise tax, which is the tax on alcohol, to every other state's tax on alcohol combined with their sales tax.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
then you're looking at, so Oregon's wine tax, for example, is 67 cents a gallon or 65 cents a gallon plus a 2-cent charge that goes to the wine board. California's wine tax is 20 cents a gallon, less than a third of what Oregon's is. So when they say, our tax is the lowest in the country, well, they roll that sales tax in, California's sales tax, and they're assuming that the bottle of wine is a $15 bottle of wine, which again is a lot of assumption. But of course, the sales tax is not an alcohol tax. And if you actually want to do an apples to apples comparison and look at all taxes that a brewery would pay in Oregon roughly 39% of your total revenue will be taxes. The national average is 34%.
Yeah.
And that's because Oregon has a lot of, like the cat tax, a lot of high business taxes. So if you really want to look at, total tax burden, you can look at total tax burden. Or if you want to look at just the alcohol tax, you can look at the alcohol tax. But if you arbitrarily combine taxes that you're comparing to Oregon's, alcohol tax, that's not a fair comparison. Our wine tax.
No, and California's sales tax isn't going to be a dedicated revenue stream for addiction either. So it's not, it doesn't make sense. In
Like I said, the whole argument, always drove me nuts, but it is one that we've seen it's even in, I believe, House Bill 3312. It was in the actual language of the bill made that claim. So things like that always drive me nuts.
One of the things about this task force, and I just went back to look at, because they have all the meetings listed online. We'll link it in the show notes. But reading the subhead of this January 12th, the very first meeting, it says, due to inclement weather and potentially hazardous road conditions, this meeting will not be held in person as originally planned. And it wasn't. It was held on Teams. And I think that is a perfect explanation for the entire life of this task force. So this task force existed, like you said, for almost 20 meetings in the year 2024. So they started in January, kind of during the short session, and we had that like snow or ice storm that sort of hit Salem. I think it snowed a little bit in Salem, maybe, but it really messed up the roads in Portland. And since a good chunk of the majority party comes from Portland, they decided to cancel the legislature that day. They don't when it snows in Eastern Oregon. Usually, they just say get over it. So anyway,
we can get over
same
the
thing with
mountains.
ODOT
You
and
guys can
roads.
make
They
it.
can't. They can't afford to plow the Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon roads, so they need more money. But anyway, that's a separate issue. But this task force, and I had the chance to, because Senator Knopp was a non-voting member of the task force, attend some of these meetings, watch some of these meetings remotely, and very early on got derailed really by members and agencies involved in the task force themselves. So after the first and second meeting, so after the first meeting held on the 12th, that was sort of delayed. You couldn't meet in person because of snow. And that's just the basic level setting meeting, starting to get to work on the work plan. There wasn't a lot that was done. January 30th, I think, actually it looks like originally the 25th, the Oregonian publishes a article that says Oregon never publicized the study it funded that found higher beer and wine taxes would barely stem heavy drinking. And I want to talk about this exact study in a minute. But really what happened, because they buried this study and didn't publicize it, and the reason they didn't publicize it is because it's not favorable to their argument. But because they hid it, they basically had to spend like the first quarter of this task force explaining themselves and trying to put to bed this controversy. And that, just like the snow, really derailed the task force early on, I think. So I'm going to read a quick tidbit here. Oregon Health Authority, one of the mandates of the task force, talking about the 3610 task force, is to examine the benefits and drawbacks of increasing taxes on wine and beer. Oregon's Health Authority already knows the answer, but it kept the findings of a $60,000 study it commissioned hush hush. The agency never publicly released the 2021 Eco Northwest study, which had clear findings about how helpful raising alcohol taxes would be to curbing heavy drinking and its terrible impacts. Not very. And as you pointed out, Mike Marshall from Oregon Recovers, I think some of the Oregon Recovers folks or people with their similar goals obviously work at OHA, the Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission as well. And so their push for this was not just the dedicated revenue source. It was the fact that by implementing a higher tax, you would theoretically have an impact on drinking, not even by spending the money, just by implementing the tax. And this report basically showed that people just go to cheaper products. Doesn't change consumption. So talk a little bit about that and how that played out in the task force.
So I'm basically that, and I actually had some involvement in that. The story started because one of the talking points that Representative Sanchez provided me before the task force started was that alcohol costs Oregonians $4.8 billion a year. They say that's the economic cost of alcohol. And that was cited to the Eco Northwest interim report. And so I looked up the Eco Northwest interim report, and I found there that was that talking point. But I found it odd that it was called the interim report. And so I started looking for the final report, which of course
Mm.
I couldn't find anywhere, but I did find was the name of the author of the Eco Northwest report. And so I Googled him and found a YouTube talk that he gave. And he talks about, that 4.8 billion figure. And then he keeps talking and presented all this information about how taxes were not very effective at controlling consumption. I found it odd that none of that was in the interim report. And so I reached out to him, and he indicated to me that OHA had misrepresented his findings and had suppressed the final report, that they had provided a final report to OHA, and that OHA had purposely not released it. And so, I understood that a reporter had also filed some public records requests. And so I looked at her public record requests and obtained copies of the same emails that she did. And I read through thousands of OHA emails, and in there, they basically received the final report. They did not like the conclusions because, like you said, it was contradictory to their desire to raise taxes. They explicitly say that. Mike Marshall, they share it with him of Oregon Recovers. He asks OHA not to share it, and they agree. They then spend the next 3 months trying to work on a spin document to downplay the findings, but ultimately they come up with a better idea, and that's just to hide the final report altogether, cherry pick the bits they like, and put them in the interim report. Eco Northwest expressed some, we'll call them ethical concerns with this, and OHA tried to comfort them, saying that they would be open to sharing the final report once their political objectives are met. Pretty black and white. They then told our task force that it was actually COVID short staffing was why this report had never made it to the public, and it wasn't intentionally withheld. Of course, we had the emails that said they explicitly were saying that. And so that's when the director, Hathy, pardon me, the new director of OHA came in to apologize to our task force. But apparently the apology didn't stick because they changed their tune again in the Willamette Week. Recently reported that actually they kept it from the public because of one of the 57 citations they're arguing was possibly funded by the alcohol industry in that report. Never minding the fact that those public records show that they already knew about that citation and had the opportunity to have it removed from the final report, but opted not to. So again, and like you said, the report explicitly says that taxes are not going to be a very good solution to impacting excessive consumers. It said, as price increases, the lowest consuming groups stop drinking first, and your heaviest consumers are the last people to be impacted by price. So if you really wanted to stop excessive consumption, you have to destroy the entire industry before you stop drinking all the way up the food chain until you finally get to those people. So ultimately, not a very viable option, and OHA knew that, and yet continues to proceed with the narrative that they have been, ever since. Oregon's top economist, Mazen Malik, also concurred that the taxes were not going to be effective. He did so in one of our task force meetings, and he called OHA's insistence to the contrary wishful thinking. So
they inherently know this, I would say, Mike Marshall
yes.
and that group of people. So it's really, I guess what I've tried to get at is they know that taxing their way into prohibition is not going to happen. So I have to ask why. And I just go, is it really just to create this hedgehog of these nonprofits that are trying to solve an unsolvable problem? Or is it, what is it just a holier than thou? And yeah, please enlighten me.
Mike Marshall is also a board member of a national anti-alcohol group, the Alcohol Policy Commission, I believe they're called. And they had a recent, what do you want to call it, a hearing. And I might add that OHA was one of the presenters at that anti-alcohol conference in DC recently. On the same day that I actually gave my presentation to the task force, they were presenting how to bend the narrative on alcohol in Oregon, but that's another conversation. Any case, they are working on a combined package of legislation to try to make the sale of alcohol onerous in multiple different facets. So you'll hear a lot of conversation, I believe, in the near future on trying to protect minors from alcohol consumption. And again, there's not really any data. Youth consumption is down 50% in the last 10 years. It's currently at the lowest rate ever recorded. So there isn't really data supporting this, but they're going to try to be pushing legislation to make it difficult where you can display alcohol in a store because, again, it might impact if it's at eye level or something of a young person, But of course, you don't have control over where stuff goes in a store, and their goal is just to make it difficult to sell alcohol. I think they feel like if they attack it from every angle, they can kind of force alcohol out of the market in the way that they feel like they were successful in doing with tobacco. Now, I might add a few other fun, is a little change, gear change, if I may. A lot of this, as you mentioned, was talking about raising funds to fund addiction recovery. And we've been told that we are severely lacking in recovery facilities, that we need to build all these new facilities. Well, OHA never actually checked how many beds are in use at any given time. There's never been a survey to see how often our beds are in use or how many patients are waiting for treatment. That entire statement that we are lacking, I believe it's 49% underserved by our recovery capacity, is based on the gap analysis report. And that gap report is a theoretical model, which they estimated what the number of beds should be. And in order to make that estimate, we're going to get a little nerdy here, but this is why this stuff matters. They use what's called the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. That's an annual survey that goes out, asks people about their drug and alcohol consumption habits. From that, this survey estimates what percentage of the population might have a substance use disorder. So the GAP report looks at the number of substance use disorders and says, well, we need this many beds. Okay. Except they changed methodologies in 2020. They changed how they defined a substance use disorder. So in the old methodology from 2019 and earlier, they used what was called DSM-4. In 2020, DSM-5. And the big difference is DSM-5 is a much more lenient definition of a substance use disorder. It found a lot more of them. So the same behavior, it found 100% more of them, to be exact. So 2020 showed double the rate of substance use disorder in Oregon than 2019 did. Well, guess what year they used of that survey for the gap analysis report? They used the 2020 data, which shows 100% more substance use disorders, double the substance use disorders. And what do you know? The equation now says you have half the beds that you need. And that gap analysis report was the sole justification for OHA's recent $6.8 billion funding request. That's what they said they need in order to combat substance use disorders and addiction in Oregon.
So they used a guess on how many people would need addiction services to guess how many beds they would need.
Rather than measuring anything. And it gets better. That data was actually thrown out and deemed unusable by the federal government because that change in methodology, they said if you go to, it's the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, if you go to the 2020 survey, it explicitly says this data is unusable. Do not use this data. The change in methodologies made this data incompatible. Don't use it. That information was available to OHA when they decided to use this data. I personally believe they chose this data specifically because it made it look like we had a much larger gap than we do. Additionally, a lot of the narrative behind this, we'll call it the addiction epidemic, is because the media falsely compared the 2019 rates of substance use disorder to the 2020 rates of substance use disorder. But the 2019 was the old methodology, the 2020, the new. And that showed 100% increase between 2019 and 2020, except it wasn't showing a change in behavior. It was just a change in how they defined
counted
a substance use disorder. And so again, when Representative Sanchez gave me her justifications for why these tax bills were necessary, one of them was a link to an article that said massive 100% increase in addiction in Oregon based on a comparison between the 2019 and 2020 data. So again, OHA has no actual physical data showing that we are lacking beds. All they have is this estimate.
Yeah. And it was about, isn't that, if I read everything, we spent about $1 billion on substance use programming and services. Okay.
That's increased our spending by $1 billion.
Yeah. $1
Mm.
billion.
And they
And then
also have no data showing that that billion improved access or that any result, they have nothing to show that that did anything beneficial for our state.
yeah, I ran across the quote from Congressman Earl Blumenauer too, and he was talking about all this, and he says the consensus of every expert they brought together is money is not the problem.
Yep.
The question is, how do you mobilize and utilize the resources we've got? So I would say with $1 billion, you have plenty of money to do youth prevention, all the things you need to do without raising more taxes. I don't think that's because you're not going to, again, they know it won't solve the problem.
Well,
So
on top of that, OHA presented they lost 72 million of it.
Hmm.
In the 21 to 23 budget cycle, which was roughly 960, $950 million is what they spent on recovery that budget cycle. They said 72 was unaccounted for, 72 million. That's
disappeared.
7.4% of every dollar spent on recovery. They don't know where it went.
How do you not know where it went? What was their
It just
accounting error?
it literally said in the report, cannot define or cannot determine, pardon me. And then we were like, what's that line item? That's a pretty big line item. That's 72 million bucks. You don't know where that went? And no.
Was
One of the
there
other
any?
things. Oh, go ahead, Brad.
Greg. No, I was just gonna try to. Was there a discussion in regards? And I have two teenage sons. You know, they're one's a junior in high school and one is now a freshman in college, and neither of them smoke or did any sort of that I'm aware of, right? I mean, again, I'm just a dad, but and none of them really drank beer or anything like that. I mean, it just wasn't because socially, it just the groups that they kind of hung with, they just weren't really into it, right? It wasn't just their thing, and I feel like with that youth group, I'm more worried about the fentanyl, the marijuana, the other kind of like the harder drugs because I mean I grew up in an era, I mean, where was always kids out, drinking Coors Light or something on a Saturday night at some bonfire, right? And Sandy where I grew up. But nobody ever got it's been around since I've been around, but the other harder drugs, I'm more concerned about that as a parent with my kids is those harder drugs that seem to be so much easier to get, but yet there's no discussion on getting rid of these drugs that literally will kill kids versus having substance abuse. And I don't know. I just seem like let's solve that problem before we start getting down into the weeds, I think. So
Yeah, certainly Measure 110 wasn't exactly, well, decriminalizing drugs probably didn't help with the consumption habits there either.
but where was was Mike Marshall against decriminalizing drugs? Where was that group at when all of that stuff was coming down? They should have been screaming from the rafters that this is horrible.
Yeah,
But
I don't know. I'd
crickets.
assume he was.
Yeah.
I would assume he probably was. But again, ultimately, as a state, we made that decision. And again, going into that addiction epidemic narrative, I think a lot of it, again, there is no data showing that substance use disorders are on the rise. We only have the one data point. The only data that hasn't been, that's the current data set is not compatible with any of the older data. So that's what we have. We have one survey
Yeah.
that says this is what our rate is. We can't say it's going up or we can't say it's going down. Okay, great. OHA told us alcohol consumption was on the rise, but again, tax records seem to refute that. They told us that binge drinking and excessive drinking were on the rise, but you're going to hear this methodology term again. What do you know? There was a change in methodology in how they measured binge and excessive drinking too. And they compared pre and post that methodology change. If you look at only the post, after the method change and how they measured that, there's no statistically significant difference in how they measure in rates of binge or excessive drinking. So that again, you can't even say binge and excessive drinking are on the rise. They've said Oregon is second worst in the nation in rates of addiction and last in access to recovery services. But they forgot to mention that survey had a margin of error so large that there is no statistically significant difference between Oregon and 37 other states in the same survey. So Oregon is not unique compared to the majority of the nation. There is not evidence showing increasing rates as they've claimed. Consumption is not spiking like they claimed, it's declining. And here's actually one that I found particularly interesting. we had a number of recovery providers testify to our task force. And one recovery provider testified that when she treats an Oregon Health Plan patient, that's somebody on Medicaid in the state of Oregon, which is the majority of patients in recovery, that the reimbursement rate she gets paid by the state is less than her cost of providing services. And so she restricts the percentage of beds that she allows recovery patients that are on OHP. We heard people in recovery say that treatment is available and beds are available anywhere in the state if you are privately insured, because private insurance pays better than OHP does. And that's where recovery providers make their profit. So we hear all this drive to build more beds, build more capacity, but of course, you can build beds, but it doesn't change the financial disincentive to treat the group that actually needs treatment, which is OHP, Oregon Health Plan patients. So again, that this wasn't, we tried to address this in the task force, but this wasn't what anybody was interested in talking about, only taxes, which of course, like you already mentioned, you can raise the funds, but how does that help, address the fact that recovery providers aren't willing to treat the majority of patients in recovery because they don't make any money when they do so?
Well, and then the money they were spending, because I saw those TV ads they were running on, the daughter in the grocery store with her dad and he's looking at a bottle of wine. And I mean, it was just like, really, Dad, and I'm just like, come on. I mean, it's in the fact that was state dollars paying for one horrible TV ads that almost make you just laugh at like what 10-year-old daughter is going to say that to her dad, and it was just so bad.
You can thank Oregon Recovers for that too. They were intrinsically involved in that project with Oregon Health Authority as well.
And to utilize kids.
What I wanted to get back to, especially, was another thing that derailed the task force that we almost forgot to talk about, which was, so you've heard Mark Marshall's name, the executive director of Oregon Recovers. He was actually a member of the task force. He was appointed to the task force, and then he, I don't have it in front of me. Maybe you remember, Aaron, but he posted something on Facebook about the death of a brewer, basically implying it was because of drinking.
Yeah. He essentially accused somebody of being an alcoholic, and that was their death, when there's, again, no evidence of that. And he was a well-loved member of the community that had a business making beer. And, we all took pretty grave offense to him dancing on this man's grave to try to push his agenda when, again, this man was not an alcoholic. He was a business owner. And, his family's grieving his loss. And, on his personal Facebook page, his memorial page, Mike Marshall is posting, anti-alcohol propaganda, trying to find an audience that way. So again, his behavior throughout this, Oregon Recovers behavior throughout this has been, poor. And Oregon Health Authority, again, I would, put their behavior also as bordering on criminal, because, they've knowingly presented data they know to be improper. They've suppressed information that's, against their agenda, and they're going to continue to do so. If you look at the final report, the language has been softened there. Number of the criticisms of Oregon Health Authority, you're not going to find sharp criticisms of the data. And in fact, some of the charts they have in their section are incorrect. The data they're presented is showing a comparison of data from different methodologies. They're claiming things that the data does not support. Like, we've already pointed this out in the task force. They already committed in the task force meeting that the chart that is in the final report was improper, and they committed to not using it in the future. And here it is again in the final report.
I just want to button up the Mike Marshall conversation. So on January 5th, Kotek had to remove him from the task force, and then this fall he announced that he would leave Oregon Recovers. That's happening this month. He ran for Portland City Council in District 2, where he received, based on the results in the first round, 2% of the vote for in a pick. I think it was pick 3 or rank. You could rank up to 6, I think.
Yeah.
of these, and then the top three, I think, from each district would get elected, and he got 2% of the vote. So the reason he's notable is because he was campaign manager for and had endorsements from John Kitzhopper
Yeah.
and some other pretty powerful, Jessica Vega Peterson, Travis Nelson. I mean, he's a well-known, very powerful political player. So, I mean, to the extent that he really, as you noted, pretty aggressively overplayed his hand in order to get booted off of this task force, was just not something you would typically do to your friends if you're in the political arena and you want to be successful. So it speaks to how aggressive he is about it. So I want to get to the final report because I think that is the most
Sure.
interesting part, because a couple of months ago we get the early draft of the final report, and I'm reading it, and all I can find is, well, here's comments from each of the task force members or their organizations. And I'm going through and I'm going, so where's the report from the task force? So come to find out, and correct me, maybe it changed in the final version. I don't think so, though. They basically just published everybody's viewpoint in the task force. The task force itself took no votes to hold any particular viewpoint that I'm aware of. They just published everybody gets a participation trophy is what this report was, and you get to
Yeah, and
participate.
the reason
I'm
it's
surprised
so
by that because that's not how task force reports typically are. Typically, the task force report is supposed to have a point of view. They're supposed to take a vote and say, this is the things we agree with or don't agree with. These are our findings, and this is what we didn't find. And then they present that to the legislature. So tell me about the final report.
Yeah, so ultimately, the reason you're not seeing a recommendation, an official recommendation, was because the majority of the task force, despite being stacked against the alcohol industry, was not in favor of a new tax. So we had conversations with every member, and we know based on the numbers that they did not have the majority. And so to avoid what I would call the embarrassment of the task force that was created to provide a recommendation in favor of new taxes, not recommending that, they opted instead to just not hold the vote. And additionally, the task force was extended by 3 months roughly to accommodate a public commentary period, which you will also not find in the final report. And
Hmm.
that's because the public comments came back 87.5% in opposition to new taxes. The comments in favor, all but four, were the form letter written by Oregon Recovers. There was
Mm.
hundreds of unique letters written in opposition. So again, those statistics you're not going to find in the final report because again, they contradict the desire, the initial reason the task force was created in the first place, which was political cover for the tax proposal, which, by the way, and again, Sanchez already had a tax proposal in the works before the task force even had a chance to provide a recommendation. She has a proposal for a sales tax this time on alcohol, with the proceeds going to youth prevention and education programs. That was going to be, again, she was already shopping it around at the governor's office and at lawmakers, weeks to months before the task force was to
So,
provide a recommendation.
September 23rd, I shared this on my social media. Willamette Week's doing candidate interviews, and there's a
Yeah.
great video that they have. I'll link up of her and her Republican opponent. And this is a central Portland district. Republicans have no chance. So I'm shocked she even had an opponent. But anyway, they get asked, and,
Tim.
and the clip is crazy to me because they ask and they say, are you working on an alcohol tax proposal? And she says, yeah. So she hasn't, you haven't even finished in September her task force. She's already working on the proposal, regardless of the outcome of the task force. And then she's asked how much it's going to be. And she says, I don't want to talk about that yet. And the clear implication is because that could have an impact on the election. They didn't want to do anything that could cause them to potentially lose the election, force all these Democrats to go on the record before the election about where they stand on this. Um, Frankly, I think I pushed a lot of Republicans to really hammer their Democratic opponents on that. I pushed the leadership to hammer. They didn't. I didn't see it. I wish they would have. I think it was sort of a missed opportunity in that election cycle. But ultimately, like you said, she was already driving towards a particular destination even before the task force was done.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I think, the assumption was, given the makeup of the task force, that it would provide a recommendation for a tax increase. And, they were just getting ahead of the game by getting the bill that they were going to propose anyway, put together. And again, this one was put together in collaboration yet again with Oregon Recovers. So while we may not know what the increase rates or the percentages are yet, we can assume, given the past two, collaborations with Oregon Recovers, it'll be designed to be equally damaging as the previous attempts. But like I said, because of OHA's, suppression of data, because of these issues where, we also had a whistleblower from the OHA send a letter to our task force just 2 weeks ago, critical that OHA was making claims yet again that the data did not support. I mean, so we were getting a lot of the data that we were looking at was not, lining up the way OHA was presenting it, and I believe that was impactful to a number of people, even those supportive of recovery services, couldn't in good conscience vote, in favor of something, given the disaster that was presented to us throughout this task force.
And I think doesn't the state of Oregon, I forget, I'd have to go look at the number, but our Travel Oregon, right, spends millions of dollars a year promoting Pinot Noir.
Yep.
And our breweries and probably Two Towns on some level. We spend millions of dollars promoting people to come to Oregon and, and go to wine country and all of the things. And amongst, the local guys that probably do it as well, even yourself there in Corvallis, I'm sure the local chamber, promotes come do the brewery tours and things like that. And so it's so counterintuitive to me that you do something that you want to promote. And I found that breweries and distilleries and wineries have done so much for these small towns and local economies, remodeling old buildings, making cool restaurants, creating a downtown vibe. I mean, when you go look at even like the downtown committees across the state, they're usually the ones that do really well will have like a local brewery, will have a local cider company like yourselves in a cool building, right, that they've rehabbed that was sitting empty for years. And it just doesn't make any sense. I'm for recovery services, but I think there's plenty of money in the system today to handle the need that's out there. There's no data that supports that we have this burgeoning crazy problem that is out of control. And so therefore the task force did its job. It found no need for taxes. So let's move on.
Amen, brother.
I mean, that's the way I see it. At the end of the day, I read through all of that stuff, and the only recommendations I found was from OHA, who basically their findings were in those comments that Reagan was talking about. I was reading through some of those individual members, and then you read OHA, they says, we need more taxes, we need this, we need television ads, and all of these things. So now they're going to couch it into these youth prevention services, because that's probably the easiest thing to try to get people to wrap their head around, right? Is like, oh, let's protect the youth, and
nobody wants to
no
vote
evidence
against the children, I think, is what the concept is. But of course, again, in what Representative Sanchez proposed to our task force, she showed a document that showed a sales tax between, I think, 1% and 8% was what her, the zone that she was looking at. And at the high end of the spectrum, at 8%, the revenues that would generate were, I believe, 25 times higher than what OHA requested in their $6.8 billion budget request for youth prevention and education services. They only asked for 5.6 million. And I asked myself, well, 5.6 million in $1 billion budget, if they can't find 5.6 million, that tells me it wasn't really a priority for them to fund in the first place. And only now, because again, it can be originally this funding was supposed to be for additional beds, additional recovery beds. But it ultimately, as we looked at it, we found that there was no evidence that we needed the beds. And in fact, we even found a federal survey in 2020 that found roughly a quarter of the beds in the state were going unused. Why? Because recovery providers were holding them back for privately insured patients. So again, they're not making any money treating the people who need to be treated. And so they restrict the number of beds that they're willing to treat patients who are on Medicaid. And of course, to have private insurance, you probably have to have a job. And if you're grappling with addiction, you probably don't have a job. And so that's the kind of the rub that we're left with. So until we want to address this underlying issue, I don't see, like I said, funding or capacity really being our constraining factors.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Brian and I on the podcast and in the legislature will definitely be watching this issue. Obviously, Co-Chair Sanchez is going to be pushing it forward, so it remains to be seen where the votes are, right? Aaron, you made a good point about them not taking a vote, because that's, the old adage in politics is when you have the votes, you vote, and when you don't have the votes, you talk. So it'll be interesting to see how much talking they do versus voting. But this will be one of those key, I think, inflection points on the session, and
Yep.
it'll be it'll just be interesting. It'll tell us how the session is going, really. So,
well, again, I very much appreciate, you both give me a platform here to talk about this. Like I said, I've spent the last year in the task force, and I spent the year before that doing research. I've read more medical studies and tax filings than I care to ever look at again in my life. But it's been nice to find some folks that are willing to listen, because I've found that by and large media and certainly lawmakers were not terribly keen on looking very deeply at a lot of these issues. And really, we got kind of fixated on this tax issue and not the underlying problems and some of the structural issues that are really potentially causing the blocking access to recovery services. And ultimately, I want to end on, I want to see people get help. If they need help, I want to help them get there. I just want to make sure that as a state, we're doing it based on reality, and we're doing it responsibly so that we can continue doing it tomorrow. Tomorrow's always a brighter day, but you can't win if you burn all your resources.
I agree. Thanks, Aaron. And I appreciate all that you did. And serving on those task forces is not easy to do. And it takes a lot of time and effort, and you got a business to run, but this is your business, right? I mean, I think Senator Knoop said it once. We were meeting with somebody, and I'll leave them not. He said, when it comes to when you're doing business in a regulatory market like this is, you either get involved or you're on the table. So, for dinner. So I think it's smart, something like that. But the idea is like get engaged and getting involved with the market and what's happened and the process and the regulatory market, in which it seems like everybody did. And hopefully we'll get the outcome. Hopefully the word is on the right path, and we'll go from there. But hopefully we won't see a tax proposal coming. But
I certainly hope not. And moving forward, now that I've done the research, I am going to apply what I've learned, and I'm going to try to keep fighting in the recovery space. And again, I would like to work, and I'll extend this to Representative Sanchez. If she would like to work with me in crafting legislation that might actually move the needle for getting people better access, I would be 100% on board to help her work through that. I can't sit idly by while people are trying to take down my business that I've spent the last 15 years building up, and the 150 families that depend on me now to keep this thing running.
Well said.